My son called me from the hospital at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in November, and I almost didn't answer. I'd seen his name on the screen and thought, not now, I'm tired, it can wait until morning. 32 years as a forensic accountant teaches you to compartmentalize. You finish one thing before starting the next. You don't let emotion rush the process. I answered anyway. Some instinct. Something deeper than training. Dad, his voice was wrong. The word came out cracked, like something had broken inside him before he'd even finished saying it. I sat up in the dark. What happened? She fell down the stairs. There was a pause that lasted too long. They're saying it was an accident. My daughter-in-law was admitted to St. Anne, Vincent's medical center in Indianapolis, with a fractured wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and a concussion that kept her in the ICU for 3 days. My son had been traveling for work, a conference in Columbus. He'd come home to find her at the bottom of the staircase in their house. My house, technically, the one I'd bought when they got married 4 years ago, because the neighborhood was good and the school district was excellent, and I believed, genuinely believed, that I was building something for my family. She fell, he told the nurses. She fell, he told the police officer who came by as a formality. She fell, he told me on the phone, and I heard the flatness in it, the rehearsed quality. The way a man sounds when he's repeating something he's been told to say rather than something he knows to be true. I didn't push. Not yet. I drove to Indianapolis the next morning, 4 hours from Cincinnati, most of it on 74, flat gray November sky pressing down on the highway. I'd made that drive 100 times over the years. Birthday dinners, Thanksgiving. The weekend they moved in and I helped carry boxes up those same stairs. I found my daughter-in-law in a hospital bed with her arm in a cast and her eyes somewhere far away. She smiled when she saw me. Too quickly, too wide. You didn't have to come all this way. Of course I did. I sat beside her. Your family. She looked at the window. Outside, Indianapolis was doing what it always does in November. Existing in shades of brown and gray, refusing to commit to winter. Her name was Phoebe. She'd grown up in Louisville, studied nursing, left that to run the administrative side of a physical therapy clinic. Smart woman. Organized. The kind of person who color-coded her calendar and remembered every birthday in a family that sometimes forgot its own. I'd liked her from the first time my son brought her home. Liked the steadiness in her. The way she didn't try to impress me. My son walked in 20 minutes after I arrived. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him, which had been Easter. His name was Colton. He was 34 years old, and he worked in corporate logistics, and he had his mother's eyes and my stubbornness. And somewhere along the way, he'd become a man I wasn't sure I recognized anymore. He shook my hand, not a hug. A handshake. Dad. Good of you to come. Of course, I said again. We stood on opposite sides of Phoebe's bed like 2 attorneys representing different clients. She looked between us and said nothing. I stayed 3 days. Slept in the hospital's family room the first night, then at a Holiday Inn 2 blocks away. I brought Phoebe coffee every morning and sat with her while Colton was at work. He went back to work on day 2, which I noted without comment. I asked her nothing about the fall. I watched instead. I watched the way she flinched when a door slammed down the hall, the way she kept her phone screen turned away from me, the way she tracked the door every time someone entered, her body going slightly rigid until she confirmed it wasn't him. On the 3rd morning, I was alone with her for about an hour. I set down her coffee and said, Phoebe, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to tell me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I don't know what you think happened. I think you know what I think, I said, and I think you're scared. She looked at her cast, the wrist the doctors had described as consistent with bracing a fall. Protective response, they'd said. Or impact. He's been under a lot of pressure, she said. That's not an answer. She pressed her lips together. He loves me. I know he does, I said. And I know that doesn't fix anything. She cried, quietly, the way women cry when they've had a lot of practice doing it without making noise. I didn't reach for her, didn't tell her it would be okay. I just sat there and let her feel it, because that's the honest thing to do, and she deserved honesty more than comfort at that point. I drove back to Cincinnati with a stone in my chest and 40 years of professional discipline holding me together. Colton called that evening. "Checking in," he said. "Seeing how the drive went." "Fine," I said. Long silence. "Dad," he let the word sit there. "I know how things look." "How do they look?" He didn't answer. "I want you to hear me," I said. "I'm not going to pretend I don't see what I see. But I'm also not going to do anything rash. I'm going to think, and then I'm going to act." He hung up. I sat in my kitchen in Cincinnati and thought about my son. Not the man on the phone, the boy who used to sit across from me at the same table doing homework while I reviewed case files. Who cried exactly once in my presence the night his mother died and spent every year after that trying to prove he didn't need to. Who had married a good woman and was systematically destroying her, and probably didn't even understand the full architecture of what he was doing. Pressure, she'd said. He's been under a lot of pressure. I opened my laptop and pulled up my notes. I spent 2 weeks making calls. Quietly, nothing confrontational. I called Marcus Webb, not the same Marcus Webb, just a name I'm using, my property attorney, who confirmed what I already knew. The house in Indianapolis was in my name. Had been since the wedding. Colton had pushed several times in those 4 years to have it transferred. Every time I'd said let's revisit that next year, and meant it less each time. Not because I mistrusted him initially. Because I was careful by nature. 32 years of forensic accounting will do that. You don't transfer assets without documentation. You don't make permanent decisions for temporary situations. I called a friend who knew someone in Indianapolis family law, explained the situation in general terms, got a name, Adrienne Cho. Sharp, she was described as. Doesn't lose often, especially in cases involving documented abuse. Then I drove back to Indianapolis. Didn't tell Colton. Phoebe was home by then, car still on, moving around the house carefully. I called ahead and she let me in. We sat at the kitchen table, and I put my phone between us with the record function off. I wasn't there to build a case against her. I was there to listen. She talked for 2 hours. It had started, she said, about 18 months after the wedding. Small things first. Criticism disguised as concern. "You're wearing that? You should see how that comes across." His mother, her name was Harriet, and I'd met her twice, both times feeling the careful inventory she was doing of my daughter-in-law, had moved in 14 months ago after a health scare that resolved itself within 6 weeks. She'd stayed. By the time Harriet arrived, Phoebe told me, Colton had stopped letting her see her own friends alone. It was always too expensive, or the wrong time, or he needed her home. Her clinic position had gone part-time at his insistence. More time for the house, he'd said. "You're always so tired. It'll be better this way." The fall down the stairs was not the first time she'd been hurt. I drove back to Cincinnati that night and cried in my car in the dark outside my house, alone, for about 4 minutes. I gave myself 4 minutes because that's what I had in me. After that, I went inside and opened my laptop and started a document. I titled it simply Timeline. My property attorney confirmed the deed situation. My name, my asset. Adrienne Cho took my call the next morning and listened without interrupting, which is the sign of a good attorney. When I finished, she said, "Do you have documentation?" I said, "I'm working on it." She said, "Get me photographs. Medical records, if Phoebe consents to release them. Any financial records showing control patterns. Cut off access, managed accounts, that kind of thing. And if there's any history with police, even wellness checks that didn't go anywhere." I went back to Indianapolis the following weekend. Phoebe had agreed to help. She was frightened, and she was angry, and she was done being both at the same time. We found 3 things. The first was a hospital visit from 13 months prior. Sprained shoulder. She'd told the ER it was from moving furniture. The nurse's notes, which Phoebe had a right to access, described her as hesitant and evasive, and noted that the injury pattern was inconsistent with her explanation. Nobody had followed up. Nobody ever follows up. The second was her bank account. Colton's name was on it. Hers was not on his. She received an allowance. He called it a household budget, transferred weekly, and he reviewed the receipts. I had Adrian document this as financial control. The third was Harriet. Harriet had been present for at least 2 of the incidents Phoebe described. She hadn't intervened. In one instance, Phoebe said quietly, she had laughed. I thought about that for a long time. I called Colton on a Thursday evening in December. I kept my voice the way I always keep it in difficult conversations, level, almost boring, like I'm discussing something administrative. I know, I said without preface. Long silence. Dad, you don't understand the full picture. I understand more than you'd like, I said, and I want you to listen to me very carefully right now. I am not calling to argue. I am not calling to give you a chance to explain. I am calling to tell you that I have spoken with an attorney, that I have documentation, and that Phoebe is not going to be in that house for the holidays. There was a pause. Then his voice changed, hardened into something I recognized as the sound of a man calculating his options. That's my house. It is not, I said. It has never been your house. And I think you've always known that, which is why you kept asking me to transfer the deed. He said something I won't repeat. I said, you have until January 3rd to make other arrangements. After that, I'll be filing for eviction based on the domestic violence protections under Indiana Code 32-31-9. Your attorney can explain what that means for your timeline. He called back 4 times that night. I didn't answer. I made tea. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the photograph on the refrigerator. Colton, maybe 12 years old, standing in front of a lake in Michigan, grinning with his whole face. That boy. That specific boy. I thought about him for a long time. Then I put the photograph face down in a drawer, because I had work to do and grief was going to have to wait its turn. Phoebe came to stay with me in Cincinnati the week before Christmas. She brought 1 suitcase. She apologized for the imposition. I told her the guest room had been waiting for exactly this kind of purpose. She slept 14 hours the first night. Colton called on Christmas Eve. His voice had softened. The calculation replaced by something more desperate. Dad, you're breaking up the family. I said, Colton, you broke it. I'm just documenting the damage. He told me Harriet was upset, that she didn't have anywhere to go. I said, Harriet is 61 years old with 3 ex-husbands and a social security number. She'll figure it out. He said, you're doing this because you always liked Phoebe better than you liked me. I sat with that for a moment, because it wasn't entirely wrong, and a man who lies to himself in his private moments isn't much of a man. I said, I'm doing this because what you did is wrong. Not complicated, not contextual. Wrong. And because I am not going to let my name on that deed mean that my property is used as the place where my daughter-in-law gets hurt again. He didn't respond to that. Adrian filed the emergency protective order the week between Christmas and New Year's. Judge Watkins, and I want to say here that I had no relationship with this judge, no prior connection. Adrian simply knew her reputation for taking domestic violence documentation seriously, signed it within 2 days. Colton and Harriet were prohibited from the property pending the outcome of the civil filing. Colton's attorney, a man named Pierce, which is a real name I'm using because it feels right, tried to argue that my son had an equitable interest in the home due to 4 years of improvements and upkeep contributions. Adrian asked for documentation. Pierce produced receipts totaling $9,000. Adrian produced my records, purchase price $287,000, property taxes over 4 years, $22,400, roof replacement $18,500, HVAC system $11,200, appliances and plumbing $8,900, total north of $340,000. The judge observed that my son's $9,000 contribution didn't establish equitable interest in a property I'd purchased in full, maintained in full, and retained the deed to throughout. Colton sat in the courtroom and watched his attorney's argument collapse the way a poorly constructed shed collapses in wind. Not dramatically, just incrementally, until there's nothing left standing. Harriet was not present. Her attorney had apparently advised her to stay home. Smart, honestly. The eviction was processed in January. A sheriff accompanied the movers. I wasn't there. I learned from other people's situations that my presence wouldn't help, would only give Colton something to direct his anger at. I'd hired a professional service. They catalogued everything. Personal items were boxed and placed in a storage unit billed to Colton. My property remained. Phoebe's attorney, separate from Adrian, a family law specialist named Constance Bird, who had 23 years of experience and an expression like she'd heard everything and was unimpressed by all of it, filed for divorce in February. Indiana is an equitable distribution state. Given the documented financial control, the medical records, the protective order, and 4 years of my daughter-in-law contributing labor to a household while being systematically cut off from her own income and independence, the distribution leaned toward Phoebe. Colton hired and fired 2 attorneys before settling on a third, who finally told him the truth. There was no version of this that ended well for him if he kept fighting. He agreed to a settlement in March. Harriet called Phoebe once from a number Phoebe didn't recognize. She left a voicemail about family and forgiveness and the importance of keeping things private. Phoebe forwarded it to Constance and blocked the number. I visited Indianapolis in April. Phoebe had moved back into the house. Her house now, transferred into her name as part of the divorce settlement, because I'd decided some things are better used as fresh starts than held as assets. She'd repainted the living room, something worn, a color between gold and terracotta that caught the afternoon light in a way the old gray-blue never had. Her sister had moved in temporarily, helping her get back to full hours at the clinic. There were plants in the kitchen. 3 of them. I don't know why I noticed the plants specifically, but I did. There hadn't been plants before. Colton had said they attracted bugs. We sat on the back porch with coffee while her sister took a walk around the neighborhood. Phoebe looked at the yard for a while. Someone had planted tulip bulbs the previous fall. She had, she told me, in October, before everything, some hopeful buried future version of herself, putting something in the ground and trusting that spring would come. The tulips were coming up now, red and yellow against the brown grass. She said, "I keep thinking about what I would have done if you hadn't come." I said, "You would have figured something out. People do." She shook her head. "No. I mean, maybe eventually." But I was so deep in it. When you're inside it that long, you stop being able to see the edges. You don't even know what outside looks like anymore. "I know," I said. She looked at me. I mean, really looked, the way people look at you when they're trying to understand something about you specifically, not just the situation. "Were you angry at him, at Colton?" I thought about it. I am his father. I have been angry at him the way you're angry at something you love that keeps disappointing you. But mostly, I was just clear. Once I understood what was happening, everything else was just steps. She nodded slowly. "Do you think he'll change?" I set down my coffee. I think he's capable of it. I think he'd have to want it more than he currently wants anything else, including being right. That's a high bar for some people. She accepted that. Didn't push for more optimism than I had to offer. Colton was living in a rented apartment in a suburb on the east side of Indianapolis. He'd kept his job, which I was glad of. Not for his sake, exactly, but because unemployment doesn't make people better, just more desperate. He'd started, I'd heard through a mutual acquaintance, going to a counselor. Twice a month at first, then weekly. I didn't call him. I didn't know what to say yet, and I've learned in my years that silence is preferable to saying the wrong thing. He called me in May. I was in my backyard, doing something that doesn't need description, except to say it involved a broken fence post and a level of stubbornness appropriate to a 63-year-old man. Dad. Hey, I said. Silence. Then I've been seeing someone. A therapist. I know, I said. Word gets around. Is that? He stopped. Is that something? It's a start, I said. It's not an ending. No, he said. I know it's not. I finished with the fence post and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing important. His job, the weather, a road closure that had been making his commute difficult, small things, the kinds of things you talk about when the big things are still too raw to touch directly. When he said goodbye, his voice sounded like the boy in the photograph. Not entirely, but some part of him. I put the phone in my pocket and looked at my fence for a while. The legal process wound down by summer. The divorce was final. The property was transferred. The protective order remained in place for another year by the judge's extension. Adrian sent me a note saying the documentation I'd provided had been one of the cleaner financial abuse cases she'd built. Not because it was simple, but because I'd known what to look for. 32 years of forensic accounting. Funny how skills move between contexts. Phoebe called me in July. She'd gone back to full-time at the clinic. She was sleeping through the night. She was taking a pottery class on Thursday evenings, which I didn't know she'd ever wanted to do. She'd started seeing a therapist herself, which she mentioned in the same breath as the pottery class, matter of fact, like it was just another thing she was building into her life. She said, I want you to know I don't blame you for Colton. I know you're going to keep carrying that. I said, I raised him. Some of that's mine. She said, people make their own choices. I said, they do. And then the people who love them have to make choices too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, thank you for making yours. I think about that sometimes, on the 4-hour drives I still make, less frequently now, between Cincinnati and Indianapolis. I think about what it means to see something clearly and still choose to act, about the difference between love and enabling, about the fact that protecting someone isn't always loud or fast or obvious. Sometimes it's paperwork. Sometimes it's a phone call you make before you feel ready. Sometimes it's putting a photograph face down in a drawer because grief is real. But timing matters. Colton is not a villain in my story. He's my son, which is more complicated than villain and harder to live with. He hurt someone I love, and he has to find a way to live inside that knowledge for the rest of his life. The counselor is helping, maybe. The distance is helping, maybe. I don't know. I don't have the kind of faith that produces certainty. What I have is this. My daughter-in-law is sleeping through the night. The tulips came up in April. The guest room in my house in Cincinnati has clean sheets and means something now. Some days that feels like enough. Most days I make it be enough. Most days I make it be enough. Because you do what you can with what you have, and then you get up the next morning and you do it again. That's not wisdom. That's just the only honest thing I know.